Sydney's population growth will decline. Let's have a look. Hello everyone, Florian.heise here, and welcome to another episode of HeiseSays. I had my stein of coffee. I thought we'd have a look at this article from news.com.au regarding the decline in Sydney's population growth. Now this is important because, frankly, it's going to have an impact on everyone's favourite topic, property prices. If population growth doesn't continue, well, you're going to see a decline in the demand for property, and that will have an impact on the market, and I wonder how the property bulls will respond to that. So you can see in this chart here, they've got, internal migration is going to go down. I wonder if overseas migration will still remain as strong, particularly with the pandemic. I can't see it remaining at high levels. We'll have to see. Brisbane, we're going there, and then Melbourne. So Brisbane, we're third. We're doing okay. We're doing okay. So let's have a look. Right now, the centres of our major cities are eerily empty. The tourists have vanished. Theatres, museums, and restaurants are closed. Shops are lonely places if they open at all. And once bustling skyscrapers full of office workers are operating on a skeleton staff with everyone else at home. Well, our tourist industry, that's... I'll bring up this chart, guys. I have to, just to show everyone the scale of that industry. It's like $60 billion, guys. It's taken a big hit. Now, is tourism going to switch right back on? Let alone migration. Is there going to be demand? And think about this as well. Now we're seeing a shift in consumer spending habits. Less people are applying for credit cards. We've talked about it in previous videos. But more people are also working from home. Now, if you can work from home and collaborate with people, you can work anywhere. I was talking to one of my clients yesterday, and he works for a big builder, and he's been working from home, and he's going, I don't want to go back to the office. I don't want to go back to the office. I'm getting so much done at home. It's working well, can collaborate. If you can have a meeting remotely, you can discuss it and solve the problems, particularly in the design and planning stage of things. It's a big part of business and demand for commercial property and demand for people to move around the place as well. That may be addressed. Are we going to see people moving a bit further out from the city, no longer needing to commute in that often, maybe only going in once a week to have a startup meeting, discussion with everyone, or maybe, twice a week. You go on Monday, you go on Friday. Friday for drinks and socializing with your office colleagues. What's that going to have? Are we going to see maybe Newcastle will start shooting up here? Or you get people moving further out. Maybe people going out in the suburbs around Brisbane to save money. What would you rather? Less commute, work from home, you eat better, you have less costs. I can see it happening. So, as we defeat or at least manage the pandemic, those people will begin to return. But one Australian capital may struggle to get its mojo back more than others in the post-pandemic era. Sydney was already facing a demographic disadvantage. With the pandemic temporarily turning off the tap to migration, there are predictions the pandemic may turbocharge Melbourne's effort to pass its rival and become Australia's largest city. That could happen in just 5 years' time. Well, let me know, guys. Where would you rather live, in Melbourne or Sydney? I grew up, my childhood, early years were in Coldstream, out near Yarra Valley, not too far from Melbourne, and I went there for conferences and things. The weather's terrible. Living in Brisbane, subtropical Queensland, what I consider cold, all the Victorians will laugh at and all the Sydneyites will laugh at, to be honest. You get adjusted to it, you become pretty soft. But it's beautiful weather up here. But I remember Sydney, just the hustle and bustle there is a bit crazy. Well, here's the other thing. I'm talking about people working from home. How many people who are living in these cities might jump ship over here? Where housing affordability, where you can sell, your starter house for $700,000, come to Queensland, Brisbane, buy, a new place for $500,000 or buy a fixer-upper for $4,000. And then you've got extra cash. Then work remotely and fly once a week or once every 2 weeks to Sydney or Melbourne. So I think it'll be a changing landscape. I think all the measures that people are using to make predictions about property, about business, about the future, I think we're going to not really be able to forecast accurately until probably maybe a good year or two ahead to see what fundamental changes occur. Once leases and commercial premises start coming up for renewal and offices are going, oh, well, we can decrease our footprint by 50%, remodel it. Maybe I should do some architectural designs for that, but still, remodel it, get smaller footprint, save on costs there, and change your office options. So Sydney is emptying out at the moment because of short-term factors, but in the medium term, it's going to have slower population growth than we've seen for a generation. Mark McCrindle, lead demographer at McCrindle Research, told news.com.au. A huge reduction in tourism, international students, and overall migration is going to be felt in our major cities over the coming year at least. Last week, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said migration could fall as much as 85% in 2021. And here's the thing, if you look at the GDP of Australia since the GFC on a per capita basis, because we've had migration coming in, it has declined or grown below trend. So our growth is growing below the average, below where it should be at. So we're getting, GDP is going down per person. Well, it's still growing, but the growth is getting lower per person. It should be going up if we're doing well. They never tell you those figures. They only give you the total numbers. Because remember, if people are migrating over, they're putting more demand. Well, they're getting a job and they're spending money here. So generally, it is about a zero net gain with migrants coming over to a civilization. The one advantage they have is when you're migrating from one nation to another or one civilization to another, you don't have the same cultural, restrictions or people telling, oh, no, you can't do that. No, you can't try that. I heard of the stories of Australians going over to America and buying investment property. And, they were treating it like they would investment property or apartments here in Australia. They wouldn't have an on-site manager. It would all be done remotely. They wouldn't tie the power into their rent. All these things. They were treating it like Australia. Over there, it was considered, culturally, oh, you can't do that. But they could do it. They got away with it, and the renters didn't mind, and it reduced their costs, and it made them more money. So it's a different perspective too. So this will particularly sting in Melbourne and Sydney, where almost 90% of overseas migrants choose to head to, at least initially. Well, yes, I know my father, he migrated to Melbourne initially. His cousin migrated to Adelaide, got off the boat and was working for Holden. That shows you how long ago he came over. Melbourne has challenges, but Sydney's challenges are greater, said Mr. McCrindle, of both cities' chances of regaining that population momentum. Each city's growth will be pared back if immigration takes time to crank up again, but Melbourne has a trump card over Sydney. Once people move to the Victorian capital, they are likely to stay. More than that, annually around 12,000 people move from other states to Victoria, most of those to Melbourne. That's interesting. Oh, I'm in Queensland because we were one of the southerners that moved to Queensland back in the early 90s. Contrast that to Sydney, where around 22,000 people last year fled the harbour city for elsewhere in Australia. Around 15,000 moved to Queensland and 6,000 moved to Victoria. Well, I can't blame them. Housing affordability, rent is expensive in Sydney. I mean, what we'll do is we'll bring up another Property Council data room, and we'll have a look, guys, just quickly at, this is a great resource. We'll look at residential rents. Residential. We'll look at median residential house rents. Canberra's the highest, 575. Then Sydney is at 550. Then Darwin, Hobart. I mean, why is Darwin and Hobart so high? Can those of you in NT and Hobart explain to me why it's so high? Then you've got Melbourne at 430 and then Brisbane at 420. And this is at the 31st of January this year. So even back then, Melbourne and Brisbane, if you're going from Sydney, you're saving $120, $130 a week on rent. That's a big chunk of your income. That's a big potential to put aside to save up for a home mortgage. And remember, guys, the world is going to change. Or the ability for people to work remotely is different to how it ever was. So we're going to see that filter through. So in total, Queensland managed to nab 23,000 fresh internal migrants, the term for people who move interstate. Indeed, Brisbane is relatively balanced when it comes to population, with its growth made up of almost equal parts overseas migrants, internal migrants and new births. In Sydney, around 60% of its growth comes from abroad. So that's going to have a big impact on Sydney. On the flip side, the natural birth rate is quite healthy in Sydney, but Mr. McCrindle said that could now become an issue too. In uncertain times, the birth rate slows. People who were thinking of having a child might weigh out the economic viability of that and proceed cautiously. Yeah, it's sad when people do. There's never going to be a perfect time to have a kid. Just do it. And, if all these articles that tell you how expensive a kid is, here's some advice from a father of 5. Just don't spoil them. Just don't spoil them. My 7-year-old the other day doesn't know what a Mars bar is. I mean, we don't buy chocolate or treats or things like that. We let them have them, particularly when they go out, and occasionally the nanas, bring all the naughty food, but that's part of being a grandparent. It's revenge on you being an annoying child. But just don't spoil them. Then they're a lot cheaper. It's real simple, guys. Every kid doesn't need an iPad. I mean, come on. In addition, Sydney-siders who had dreamt of holding down a city job but living elsewhere may now get the chance. If anything, the pandemic will make the population loss greater and give a boost to regional areas because it's shown that people can get CBD jobs without being in the CBD. Exactly. So why people are leaving Sydney? All Australian cities will have the population pressure of reduced immigration, sea changes and a slowdown in new birth. But only Sydney is coming from the starting point of losing more than 20,000 people a year. Mr. McCrindle said the main driver for Sydney-siders deserting the city was the cost of living, and I'm not surprised. I mean, those of you that live in Sydney, why don't you share some of the crazy costs that you have living in the Sydney? Sydney is an expensive city, yet you don't get paid more than you do in Melbourne. The economics of Melbourne and Brisbane are as diverse as Sydney, so people have other alternatives. Last week, Commonwealth Bank's State of the States report, which ranks the nation's strongest performing economies, placed New South Wales 4th, aside from 3rd in the previous analysis. Victoria remains the best performing state. Like Mr. McCrindle, Chief Economist of CommSec Craig James said while both New South Wales and Victoria could face hurdles post-pandemic, the state north of the Murray had the weaker hand. It's going to be more difficult for economies in the next couple of years because of the slowdown in population due to the pandemic. Certainly, we'll have fewer migrants coming to Australia, and they often reside in New South Wales or Victoria. But when they come to New South Wales as a first port of call, some then move to other states and territories, and that's been the situation for some time, he told news.com.au. Yeah, because they probably know, smart, and realise, I'm not paying this much to live in this place. It's insane. Fewer people coming to Sydney would mean less demand for housing, great for some, but it could also lead to less homes being built, throttling back an engine for economic growth. Fewer immigrants also means fewer talented people from overseas to fill jobs. Here we go. I mean, this is the thing, housing as a throttle of economic growth. The problem is Sydney has had the throttle of economic growth, and you've had so many issues with your buildings. So many issues with your buildings. Just have a look at my playlist of Opal Tower and all of the other buildings. I call it the triangular fail down there, and I've got it on my Google Earth. And I'll bring it up in a moment to show you. Just all around north of Botany Bay, near the airport, all that contaminated ground there. It's you can't even dig down there in your own bloody garden. It's terrible. We'll bring this up here, and we'll see here construction issues, and you can see, we zoom in here to Sydney, and the triangular fail, and you've got others. Because if you go back, 100 years, this was all industrial area, all contaminated, and it's all leaching in the water table down to the bay. And when they're pumping water out, and they've got even like Sugar Cube has huge contamination issues here on the site. Huge contamination issues. the contaminated soil that was removed from the site has been left on the site. So, people can't occupy the buildings. I have to follow up on that. I don't even know if they're actually able to occupy it yet. You've got Joshua Buildings issues. You've got Otto Roseberry issues. You've got Zetland. They've just been sitting there empty, and people don't want it to get out because they don't want their properties to lose value. You've got Mascot as well. So maybe the the building throttle in Sydney should slow down a little bit. Maybe it should, because it's been overheating. And that has been demonstrated by just the rampant number of building construction issues in your city. So Melbourne could leapfrog Sydney. An effect of the pandemic could be that Melbourne leapfrogs Sydney's population sooner than thought. According to the ABS, Sydney's population of 5.3 million is growing at 1.7%, and Melbourne is at 5.1%. But it's getting bigger, faster, at an annual rate of 2.3%. Melbourne is not as dependent as Sydney is on overseas migration. That could be speeding up the closure of the population gap between the two cities. By the middle of the decade, we expect Melbourne to overtake Sydney to become the #1 city and be the first Australian city to reach 6 million people. We'd expected Melbourne to overtake Sydney in the second half of 2026, but it could be late 2025, so the pandemic could bring that time frame forward. He said Sydney would pick itself and dust itself off, but by then Melbourne's march to #1 might be unstoppable. Sydney will come back. It's a global city, a destination for tourists and for business people. However, for the next year or so, the growth from net migration will be fairly slim, so we will see a massive slowdown in its population growth. So there you go, guys. There you go. Another argument counter to the, property bull narrative, FOMO narrative, that demand will always go up. We'll have to see. But still, concern that we may throttle back, frankly, what I would argue, overheated industry, which has manifested in just destruction, in confidence, in multi-res buildings in the whole nation, particularly in Sydney. What do you think, everyone? Are you worried about the population growth decline in Sydney? Do you think Melbourne will be #1? Or should we all just move a bit further out, save some money, and increase our quality of life? As always, thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Please let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. If you're a fan and want to support us, there are a few ways you can. You can join us on YouTube or Patreon. Support us via our affiliate links at Amazon or eBay, or Independent Reserve and Kucoin. You can use Gold Pass from the Perth Mint. Support us by buying our merch at HeiseSays or PayPal. Take care, guys. I'll see you next time.